Our first presentation will be on transition from unitary to federal structure in Nepal, and the presenter is Dr. Bipin Adhikari, and I think most of the people in this room needs no introduction from Bipin. I think Bipin is very well known to all the development community, and he has done a lot of work in this area. But still, for the benefit of those who don't know Bipin, I would like to give brief introduction about him. Dr. Adhikari is working as a constitutional expert in Nepal for quite some time, not only in the current context, even before 1990 constitution, he has contributed a lot. And another very significant milestone for Dr. Adhikari is he has played a very instrumental role in setting up his faculty of law in Kathmandu University, and he has established that 5 years back, and now he has successfully handed over that faculty, and it is running very well. And as I said, Dr. Adhikari has extensively written on constitutional issues in last couple of years, and his writing both in Nepali and English, interview on the televisions are all known to you. And before I hand over this presentation to Dr. Adhikari, I also like to urge all of you to go and read Dr. Bipin Adhikari blog. It is very informative in the area of federalism and other contemporary development challenges issue. Now over to Dr. Adhikari.
Dhanyavad, namaste. Very generous introduction. I think sometimes it makes one very ambitious. It should not be the case. I think the topic we are talking about are really very interesting and topical in several sense. The issues facing federalism, there are issues obviously, but then we also have problems in the perspective as well as a definite lack of orientation on what sort of federal system we have, what the Constitution has actually created, and what sort of expectation we need to have within it. And that is always a challenge. Now that since I know that this program is being organized in order to facilitate the understanding of development partners about Nepal's federal system, especially where is Nepal in its transition to federalism, I think some key issues must be explained. The Nepal's federal system basically is a three-tier federal system, which is quite uncommon in the world. There are 3 tiers of governance everywhere in the world, but then the three-tier federal system is something very unique, and this has been constitutionally entrenched in Nepal. So we have the federal government at the top and provinces in the middle, and then the local governments at the bottom. They all exist side by side and coordinate power system, and these governments they are entitled to their own schedule of power. So this division of power is very unique in Nepal, because this is something for the first time that the inbuilt structure of the constitution has a clear list about what sort of powers local government is going to exercise within the framework of three-tier federal system. The core provisions and principles of federalism under the constitution. The nature of federal system in Nepal is basically we have a cooperative federal system. So it's not a classical system, and by classical system we tend to take American example as an important example. It's not classical. It's very cooperative, and we had a unitary state which has now been federalized under explicit constitutional terms. The Constitution talks very well. The Constitution talks very clearly that the relation between federation, provinces, and local level will be based on the principle of cooperation, coexistence, and coordination. So it's not complete autonomy. It's not that some states have come together and formed a federal government while most of them retain their overall sovereign powers, and the federal government is entitled to only selected important international leadership. So not only international but also some core domestic on core domestic issues, the federal government takes the leadership. So this is not the case here. The constitution is very clear. Obviously, the federal government has more powers because it deals with money, it deals with overall economic policies. It also deals with emergency powers and also some some core federal issues, including foreign relations. But then, even in other areas, it has very important powers, and these powers often overlap with the provinces or local governments if not handled carefully. The division of powers, as I said, is not like what was proposed in the beginning was, certain powers were reserved for the federal government and the rest were handed over, supposed to be delegated, supposed to be given to the provinces and local government. So that has not been the case now. We have, the major powers are with federal government, but then there are some exclusive powers given to the local governments as well as provincial governments, and there are two concurrent lists, and these concurrent lists are very exhaustive lists. So most of the time, the Constitution, is very explicit that when an issue of concurrent list is to be handled, the federal parameters will be paramount. So it will be the federal government which will handle the major policy issues. It will also make the enabling law, and within this policy and enabling laws, the provincial governments will, craft out their autonomous activities within their province. So obviously, when you have a federal system, federal parameters that certain powers are given to the provinces and local governments, they are entrenched, and when they violate the core principles of federalism, then they are entitled to go to the court and establish their power when there are unconstitutionality issues or even overlaps which are being interpreted in the interest of federal government. So these the system expects some overlaps, but then they have to be cleared by federal policies in some core areas and also by making new laws. Now, in this process, residuary power, that again belongs to the federal government. So that makes something very clear departure from many of the other jurisdictions where the residuary powers are with the provinces, with the states, or let's say the local governments. So in our case, it's for example, in the American system, the residuary power, constitutionally, it vests with the states who came to join to form the union, and that makes them at times very strong. So these most of the policy issues, the Constitution is very clear that in areas, for example, let's take forest management. The forest policies have to be determined by the federal government. And on the basis of forest policies that have been determined, the federal government will work out a federal legislation, and on the basis of that federal legislation and also the forest policies, the provincial government will manage the forest. So the management of forest, obviously, except certain national parks and certain watershed areas, they are given to the provinces. So apparently, the provinces will not be able to exercise their power until the federal government comes out with an enabling forest act, now which is in this particular case is pending in the parliament. The bill has been introduced, but not subjected to rigorous procedures as yet. And that makes difficult for most of the provinces and the local governments as well to exercise their powers which have been constitutionally entered. Now, similarly, there are issues related with environment, issues related with communication. There are all these issues. The federal government has the key. So the leadership of the federal government cannot be sidelined in all these things. Again, we have the legal regime at provincial level. The provinces are, in fact, they have moderate amount of power. With increasing institutionalization, they will be entitled, they will be able to claim more and probably exercise more powers once the situation is clear. And we are still in the process of building the legal regime, and the provincial legal regime is something which comes as a major challenge because the federal government has been quite slow in its understanding of the situation, its orientation, and also working out some framework legislation. And that has given some sort of dissatisfaction at the provincial level. For example, we already faced the problem of provincial public service commission. Now that the appointment power is a key administrative power. If we cannot appoint people, we cannot probably create an accountable government system, accountable administrative system within province. But then the management of the central government, federal government employees has been a problem that has taken most of the time, and the adjustment issue has not been settled to the satisfaction of provincial and local government. That is one issue. The other issue is they also have, in some core issues, for example, public security. Is any government worth its name, will be able to show that it exists as a government only when it has certain police powers, and that again is subject to the making of a police law which will respond to the federal requirements, and then also enable the provinces to draft their own regime subject to the federal policy and federal laws. Here again we have a problem. Similarly, we have problems related with major development issues. Now the Constitution has divided the power regarding development projects also, and they have been done based on our ground realities. The problem is the central level institutions, for example, National Planning Commission. It's not a constitutional body, but it's an important federal arm, and that has to cater to the requirements of planning needs of all of the government as a whole. And here the setup that we have is inherently is federal, inherently based on the notion of a unitary government. And now there are provincial stakeholders, local governments, they need policy guidance, they need some sort of planning assistance, and it's here that the existing institution is not able to cater properly. Similarly, we have the legal regime at the local level. The local level, I think it has started to function very effectively. I mean, we can be very hopeful that it will grow, mature in course of time. The situation, they started before the provincial government, and they have the sea change that has been brought is the allocation of the federal government money, the allocation of federal grant, which the local governments have been able to work on according to their own policy and program priorities. And that is certainly an important departure now, and that has created a very lively atmosphere at the local level. Now, the problems of legal regime is there as well. Most of them suffer from the problem with the lack of power. In fact, they have the power, but then they also have problem with appointing necessary human resources, giving them some sort of career. Also, working with certain they coordinate their activities with the province or with the federal government, the compliance with procurement laws, Also, problem with policy engagement, because they want to localize the nucleus of power at the local level, and it has not happened because they don't have necessary background, the capacity, as well as the ability to engage other stakeholders as a coordinate branch of the government. So similarly, the development of provincial and local laws have been rather slow. Most of the time, the model laws that have been offered by the federal government have been appointed, they have been utilized, but without really knowing how they should be modified in the local provincial context. And when they tried, most of these provinces, for example, we talked already about police, administration, that whenever they they wanted to go ahead, based on their own requirements, and they found federal resistance. And the federal resistance was important, because after all, the security system in the country has to be integrated, and unless the federal norms are clear, the provinces have the potential of aligning with something that is not federally intended. So that has remained a problem. Now, building local institutions, it all starts with how the local assemblies or the municipalities and village bodies start working as a parliament. Now, as a legislature, the Constitution in fact talks about 3-level legislature. So, irrespective of the name given, they all are legislature, and they have to perform like a legislature. This has not happened because the parliamentary institution at times have problem even at the federal level. So these problems are there at the provincial level, at the local level also, and in most of the local cases we know that they don't even have the proper exercise of how the federal institutions as a federal legislature should work at the local level. That has been a problem. Now, I talked about the outreach capacity of the National Planning Commission, but building the capacity of the National Natural Resources and Fiscal Commission is also very important. It's a very significant body. The more it becomes stronger, the political biases of the federal government will, the more it will be minimized, because it has certain independent power in devising the policy for awarding federal grants or even deciding equalization and all these things. So they have to be able to work with the provinces as well as the local government. As yet, we are not clear how it's going to be done, because the existing laws they mostly cater to the opinion of the federal government, but not necessarily of the local and provincial governments. Now, similarly, the worries of the provincial skeptics. There are, most of the time we read in the newspapers that the provinces mostly think that the local governments have started to perform and the federal government is already there with the lion's share of power. So they are not having enough space to grow, and partly because of lethargy at the federal level, and partly also because that the local government have taken up, have been given the power that otherwise they should have been guaranteed with. Now, most of their concerns are what I think is not really based on facts, because the provinces have not been able to coordinate with the rest of the local governments within their, within the districts or within their province. And it has happened because they think that coordination is not something that has been adequately stated in the Constitution. So with some support to them to start, working together with the whole province, the local governments as well as district committees, I think they will be able to integrate with the rest of these governments and feel more stronger in its relationship with the federal regime. Now, the Interprovincial Council also it has now finally it has started to work, but it has not been very active in dealing with the grievances coming up from the field, from the province and the local level. Similarly, the most of these controversial issues. Now there are, I don't want, the word controversial is too difficult to it's heavy, but there are issues everywhere, and simply because they have not been properly handled. Now that requires some sort of confidence building, and that is within the prerogative, within the power of interprovincial council, and what the government has, especially the federal government, has to be very keen in maintaining that its power, its leadership power, is a byproduct of Article 232(1) of the Constitution, which I said read in the beginning, that the relations between the federal government, provinces, and local level have to be based on cooperation, coexistence, and coordination. And when the leadership power is exercised without these basic parameters that the Constitution has outlined, most of the time the expectations of the provincial government and local government will be compromised, and it is there that the some sort of intervention will be necessary. I think these are some basic highlights. I think there are many queries and many concerns, but I think it will not be possible to respond to all the queries. But there are some very important ones. So there is a question how the province or the provincial or local governments can respond.
So now time up for the question, okay?
When there are laws that marginalize their concurrent list of power, which is to their disadvantage and to the advantage of federal government. I think it's always possible to move to the Supreme Court when there are legal or constitutional issues involved. The Supreme Court has a provision of constitutional bench, and that is supposed to be a prototype of a constitutional court which can handle all type of federal disputes. So it is possible. However, the problem again is with the concept of constitutional bench. It is being implemented in a way that is more traditional than which lacks federal orientation. There is a need of some sort of intervention to look into the operation of constitutional bench and help divide it into a prototype of a constitutional court within the Supreme Court. There will be problem with the speed of resolution of federal cases, but nevertheless there is a provision, and the people who have concern can move the Supreme Court even as a public interest litigation. Similarly, the transition, how long it's going to last? I think Americans, you can see they are still in transition. So the federal government that was divided 240 years before, it didn't talk about how the issue of terrorism should be handled by a modern democracy. So, because the law and order is always a state subject. Now, after so many years, the court has permitted the federal government to enact laws dealing with terrorism as a federal topic. Now, because the challenge that has been created, it becomes a federal challenge, irrespective of the fact that the Constitution remains the same in black and white. So the transition, it's a long transition, but I think values will be settled as we start practicing it and as we develop necessary laws and institutions. But it will take at least 10 to 20 years, I'm sure. So similarly, the basic service delivery, it is going on. It's only that the intervention of the stakeholders have been limited. So I don't think that's so. Similarly, the difference, the difference between tiers and levels, I really don't know. but maybe our English speakers can talk about that. For me, 3-tier or 3-level is same. This is what I see as a constitutional lawyer. So if there are issues which are very concrete issues, we can still talk about that. So the process is ambitious. Nepal's federal transition, we are in a process which has a very long way to go. Because as we become stronger and the provincial and local governments become assertive, the nature of the federal transition will be affected. And so it has to go that way. This is what has happened in most of the federal countries. Even in our neighborhood, for example, India, you can see that the federal experience in the 50s was not as strong as it is now. Because the federal government, for example, is very convinced about the ability of the states to handle their affairs on their own, even on important policy issues, because they have achieved that capability by way of experience over these 7 decades. So I think that it is ambitious, but then it can be handled well. On the hiring and firing, the present law, we have the local governments can always hire and fire based on contracts. The issue is how to appoint permanent staffs who think that they have a career at the local level or at the provincial level, irrespective of their relation with the federal government. Now is there that we have a problem. The current problem of the federal government is it needs to adjust all the central government employees, and they cannot just be whisked away. They need to be managed well, and while managing well, the expectations of the local government and the provincial government have to be adequately met. Especially they want control and supervision. That is not the case now. Now that it's not a problem that they are federal government employees. The problem is they don't respond to the local authorities and the provincial authorities, and most of that their orientation is towards the federal government, not the local or provincial government, and that is the reason that most of the people who have been transferred to the field, their whole effort is to get back to the center as soon as possible, and this is what we have seen most of the time. So these are some of the issues I talked about. Now there are issues, there are many questions I think, but fundamentally Dr. Bhurtel had a question too. He was saying, how can you say that it's a cooperative federalism, which gives more responsibility to the federal when the provision of the constitution is very clear that is based on cooperation, coexistence and coordination. So that's true. Now cooperative, because cooperation does not mean I take the lion's share of power. Cooperation means I sit with others and take a stop of things before I decide. Now for that to happen, the Interprovincial Council has to be very effective, and as I noted, the National Natural Resources and Fiscal Commission, which talks money, has to be strengthened, because with these 2 key institutions within the constitution, if they are strong enough, the prerogative, or say the not the prerogative, but the discretionary power of the federal government will automatically come to a standstill. It will have to negotiate, talk, seek cooperation, and also ensure that the coexistence is assured to all. So that is a very significant power, and in the days to come, the Supreme Court will have to interpret the Constitution based on this Article 237, and which will ensure that the federal, the units, the provincial governments or local governments should not be taken for granted. They are entitled. They have certain entitlements and they are constitutionally entrenched. We can always say that you have a power of coordination, it's not a power to lead all the time at the expense of the provincial or local governments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bipin. Last question. I try to summarize some of the questions from the participants, and I think this is a very important thing. I mean, in your experience, what are the major risks? Do you see that there may be possibility of derail of the federalism rollout in Nepal? Do you see any risks?
I don't think it is possible. You see, if we have a healthy practice, it will go smoothly and we can achieve the constitutional objective very soon. But if it's not healthy, and there is, if the leadership of federal government becomes overbearing, probably it will be difficult to discipline many of the sectors which are so important in the constitutional system. And we can talk more.
Thank you.
Time permitting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bipin ji.